Hello and welcome to my presentation and evaluation of a clustered randomized trial which focused on a school-based mental health intervention for children in war-affected Burundi. Let's begin the discussion with some background on the program. Over 1 billion children and adolescents live in countries and territories affected by armed conflict, the majority in Africa. Burundi, a landlocked country in the Great Lakes region of Eastern Africa, has a population of approximately 8.5 million and is one of the poorest countries in the world. It ranks 185 out of 187 countries on the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is a summary measure of the achievement of 3 key aspects of human development: a long and healthy life, being knowledgeable, and having a decent standard of living. Burundi has been experiencing ongoing political instability, armed conflict, and ethnic violence between the Hutu and Tutsi ethnic groups from 1962 through the time this study was conducted. Epidemiological studies indicate that armed conflicts can result in a range of child mental health outcomes. In this study, a clustered randomized trial was conducted in 2 northwestern provinces of war-torn Burundi between October 2006 and October 2007. The study evaluated the effectiveness of a school-based intervention focused on reducing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety, which were treatment aims, as well as improving a sense of hope and functioning, which were preventative aims. The study was conducted with 329 children aged 8 to 17, composed of 48% girls and 52% boys. 153 children participated in a 15-session school-based intervention implemented by paraprofessionals, and the remaining 176 children were in the control group. Outcomes were measured before, 1 week after, and 3 months after the intervention. The 2 provinces where the study was conducted were selected because of their continued exposure to political violence and for the homogeneous socio-cultural context and trained paraprofessionals in the area. The researchers then selected 14 schools or 7 schools per study condition. Children were screened within the schools using standardized symptom checklists to determine who to include in the intervention group. A classroom-based intervention was delivered by paraprofessionals in a series of 15 sessions over a 5-week period. The intervention focused on decreasing psychological symptoms and strengthening protective factors of children at risk who are displaying elevated psychological symptoms. Instruments were translated to prepare them for transcultural research, including bilingual translation. Psychological symptoms and affect were measured using several different scales. All measures were administered in private school settings by trained interviewers over a 4-week period and were applied 1 week before the intervention, 1 week after the intervention, and 3 months after the intervention. No main effects of the intervention were identified, and there were mixed results and trajectories between study conditions in interaction with several moderators. The results from the study add to several other studies that have evaluated this school-based intervention in other conflict-affected areas of the world. Because of inconsistent results concerning outcome measures across several settings, including Burundi, implementing this intervention is not recommended for the treatment of PTSD, depression, or anxiety in children and adolescents in conflict-affected areas. Instead, it's recommended that World Health Organization guidelines for nonspecific health settings in low- and middle-income countries be followed. These include cognitive behavioral treatments and eye movement desensitization reprocessing. A series of 6 checklists were used to assess threats to the validity of the findings of this cluster randomized trial. The threats to validity assessment was conducted to determine how well the school mental health intervention for children in war-affected Burundi cluster randomized trial was conducted and why. The items in each checklist were scored based on 2 criteria. Criteria number 1 focuses on the existence or seriousness of each threat to validity and uses a 5-point scale, with 1 meaning that the methodology is sound and there are no issues or problems, and 5 meaning that there are major methodological problems and issues. Criteria number 2 focuses on the importance of this threat for the purposes of this particular evaluation. If any of the items in the checklist receive a rating of 4 or 5, for criteria number 1, a check mark is included for criteria number 2, indicating a methodological problem. Mean scores are calculated for criteria number 1, resulting in a summary score, and the number of check marks are tallied for criteria number 2, which provides the number of methodological issues potentially affecting the use of the evaluation. The scores for each of these areas are featured at the top of each checklist slide. We will look at the strengths and areas of improvement for each of the 6 checklist areas. Objectivity. The methods, including participant screening, intervention design and delivery, instruments, and procedures, were very detailed and well explained, and the data presented in the results section was robust and helped to support conclusions. The data was also outlined in easy-to-read tables and figures, which helped ease analysis. There were several factors that contributed to research bias, including statistically significant differences between study conditions at baseline between the control and intervention groups, and research assessors who were working independently from the implementation team were not blinded to the study condition because they had to visit schools to interview study participants. The lack of blinding may have biased findings in favor of the intervention. A significant amount of attrition, as well as students who refused to participate in both the intervention and control groups, also occurred, and relatively few schools were randomized. Internal design validity. This study demonstrated high internal validity and credibility by incorporating context-rich and meaningful descriptions of their methods and measures, as well as a detailed description of their procedures. Well-trained intervention facilitators and interviewers who were local to the area and had an affinity for working with children were chosen. And no apparent budgetary or time constraints were noticed, and there was an adequate sample size and robust data. The largest threats to internal design validity included the potential for recall bias among intervention participants and also attrition due to loss to follow-up and dropouts from the intervention and control groups during T2, and lack of specification of the rules used for confirmation of the study hypotheses. We recommend taking steps to mitigate attrition and account for recall bias, and also specify rules for the confirmation of study hypotheses. Threats to statistical conclusion validity. The data collected is supported through follow-up discussions, and researchers utilized an adequate sample size that reflected the target population. Measures were also taken to ensure that all intervention groups received the intervention identically. Despite the lack of effect of the program, researchers reported findings indicative of their results and did not manipulate the data in favor of the intervention. The largest threat to statistical conclusion validity is the influence of external events that stem from war-related and community violence in Burundi. Although necessary precautions were taken to ensure the safety of participants and facilitators through location selections, the area where the intervention took place has a history of political and intertribal violence, and incidents of violence occurred during the data collection period of this study. Construct validity. The study utilizes a high level of treatment to assess all of the introduced constructs, and throughout the duration of the program, new themes and areas of focus were introduced during the weekly sessions. Although researchers expected results to vary by age and gender, these expectations did not influence the intervention implementation or data collection. Threats to construct validity included observing and gathering data on intervention and control participants in a school-based setting rather than other community settings, creating a mono-method bias. Researchers did not do an adequate job of defining constructs such as secondary outcomes, hope, and functioning. These can create ambiguity and undermine the construct validity of the study. Finally, since the program was being introduced to this area for the first time, the potential for novelty and disruption effects were also present. External validity. This study does a good job of describing the entire population of interest, and it provides the age range, average age, and gender of the sample. The study also provides baseline data for intervention and group control participants. The program intervention activities and data collection methods are stated thoroughly, making it possible for the study to be replicated. This intervention is not recommended as a treatment for PTSD, depression, and anxiety symptoms because of inconsistent results regarding the primary outcome measures. Given that the setting of the study takes place in a war-torn area, processes and findings are very specific to this particular setting, making it not generalizable in other settings that are not undergoing similar political instability and violence. Utilization. There were no ethical concerns, and the findings were accessible to potential users. Utilization was the weakest area of the study, with numerous operational problems, including this study hypothesizing that the intervention would be associated with larger improvements in coping and social support among children in the intervention condition, and that these improvements would then be associated with improvements in PTSD, depressive and anxiety symptoms and hope, and function impairment. This hypothesis was not correct, as the study did not find any main effects on the primary and secondary outcome measures. The intervention length was only 5 weeks long, and this does not allow enough time to realize the effects the intervention was attempting to produce. A longer intervention may have yielded more favorable results. The authors indicated that for treatment purposes, other interventions may be more suitable. Given that there have been inconsistent results across different settings, they recommended that it may be better to start with the World Health Organization's recommendation guidelines for the treatment of PTSD in children and adolescents. There are several operational problems with this cluster randomized trial, which were discussed when reviewing the findings of the 6 checklists. The most serious of these operational problems include researcher bias, participant attrition, and refusal to participate, which are threats to objectivity. Research assessors who were working independently from the implementation team were not blinded to the study condition because they had to visit schools to interview study participants. This may have biased findings in favor of the intervention. The potential for recall bias and participant attrition were also threats to internal design validity. Ongoing violence in the study area threatens statistical conclusion validity, and mono-method bias and novelty and disruption effects threaten construct validity. Inconsistent primary outcome results and the inability to use the intervention for PTSD, depression, and anxiety treatment threatens external validity, as does the lack of generalizability of the study. And finally, utilization is the weakest area of the study because of inaccurate hypotheses, an intervention time period that's too short, inconsistent findings, and a lack of usability of the intervention for treatment purposes. The cluster randomized trial has several strengths, including highly detailed descriptive methods, robust, well-presented data, well-trained staff, an adequate sample size, comprehensive intervention activities, and ethical handling of all aspects of the study. Areas in need of improvement include researcher bias, participant attrition, mono-method bias, too short of a time period dedicated to carrying out the intervention, and lack of generalizability. This study can be improved by lengthening the time allocated to carry out the intervention and by taking steps to mitigate researcher bias as well as to prevent participant attrition through the analysis of potential follow-up interviews with those who left the program or the staff who worked with them while they were in the program. Thank you for taking the time to view my presentation.